They were the chosen followers of Jesus, but not all of their voices survived. Some were erased, others condemned, and their gospels hidden for centuries beneath the sands of time. This is the story of the apostles they almost erased, the forbidden disciples whose words might have changed Christianity forever. What if everything you thought you knew about the 12 disciples was incomplete? What if there were gospels written by apostles whose names were struck from the official record? What if the early church didn't just preserve the teachings of Jesus, but actively decided which teachings would survive and which would disappear forever? Tonight, we're diving into one of history's most carefully guarded secrets. The story of the apostles they almost erased. The hidden gospels that reveal a Christianity far more mysterious and controversial than anything you've encountered before. Because buried in ancient caves and forgotten libraries lie texts that could fundamentally change how we understand the origins of the world's largest religion. Before we begin this journey into forbidden history, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Because what we're about to uncover has been deliberately hidden for nearly 2,000 years. And channels like ours are among the few places where these suppressed truths can still be explored without interference. The story begins in the most unlikely of places: desert caves in Egypt, crumbling monasteries in remote mountains, ancient libraries that were sealed these forgotten corners of the world, archived for centuries. Enologists and scholars have been making discoveries that shake the very foundations of Christian history. Manuscripts written in languages that haven't been spoken for over a millennium. Gospels attributed to apostles who supposedly never wrote anything. Letters that reveal teachings so radical they had to be buried alive. Oh, these aren't modern fabrications or conspiracy theories. These are authentic ancient documents, many of them older than parts of the New Testament itself, carbon dated to the 1st and 2nd centuries after Christ, written by communities that claim direct connection to the original apostles. And what they reveal about early Christianity is absolutely staggering. You see, most people assume that the story of the apostles is simple and straightforward. Jesus chose 12 men to follow him. They witnessed his ministry, his death, and his resurrection. They went out into the world to spread his message. They wrote some letters and gospels that became the New Testament. End of story. But here's what that neat narrative leaves out. The early Christian movement was chaotic, diverse, and deeply divided about fundamental questions. Who was Jesus really? What did his teachings actually mean? Which of his followers had the authority to interpret his message? And most crucially, which texts contained authentic apostolic wisdom and which were dangerous deceptions? The answers to these questions weren't settled by divine revelation or scholarly consensus. They were decided by political power, institutional control, and sometimes outright violence. The Christianity that emerged victorious from these early conflicts wasn't necessarily the most authentic version. It was simply the most organized, the most politically connected, and the most willing to eliminate its competitors. This brings us to a shocking realization that most Christians never confront. The 12 apostles we know from the New Testament represent only a fraction of the disciples who claimed to carry Jesus' authentic teachings. There were other apostles, other gospels, other versions of Christianity that were systematically suppressed as the official church consolidated its power. Consider the Gospel of Thomas, discovered in Egypt in 1945. This text claims to contain the secret sayings of Jesus, recorded by Didymus Judas Thomas, identified in some traditions as Jesus' twin brother. The Gospel opens with a declaration that immediately sets it apart from anything in the canonical New Testament. These are the secret words which the living Jesus spoke and which Didymus Judas Thomas wrote down. The teachings contained in this gospel paint a picture of Jesus that's radically different from the figure most people know. This Jesus doesn't perform miracles to prove his divine power. He doesn't establish churches or appoint bishops. Instead, he reveals that the kingdom of heaven is not a future destination, but a present state of consciousness that can be discovered within every human being. When his disciples ask him when the kingdom will come, Jesus responds in a way that would have shocked the early church fathers. The kingdom will not come by waiting for it. It will not be a matter of saying, here it is or there it is. Rather, the kingdom of the Father is spread out upon the earth, and men do not see it. This isn't the apocalyptic Christianity that expected Jesus to return and establish an earthly kingdom. This is mystical Christianity that taught direct spiritual experience and inner transformation, and it's attributed to one of the 12 apostles who was supposedly there from the beginning. But Thomas wasn't the only apostle whose authentic voice was suppressed. The Gospel of Philip, another text discovered in the Egyptian desert, presents teachings attributed to the apostle Philip that completely contradict official church doctrine. This gospel describes Jesus as having an intimate relationship with Mary Magdalene, referring to her as his companion and suggesting that she understood his deepest teachings in ways that even the male disciples didn't. The text explicitly states that Jesus loved Mary Magdalene more than all the other disciples and used to kiss her often on her mouth. When the other disciples become jealous and ask why he loves her more than them, Jesus responds with a question that reveals the spiritual blindness of his male followers. Why do I not love you like her? This portrayal of Jesus as having normal human relationships, including potentially romantic ones, represents a completely different understanding of incarnation than what Orthodox Christianity developed. Instead of the celibate, otherworldly figure of later church tradition, the Gospel of Philip presents a Jesus who was fully human while simultaneously serving as a guide to divine consciousness. Even more controversial is the Gospel of Mary, which presents Mary Magdalene not as a reformed prostitute, as later church tradition would claim, but as Jesus' most advanced disciple, the one who received his deepest teachings about the nature of reality and spiritual development. In this text, Mary shares private revelations that Jesus gave her after his resurrection, teachings that the male apostles had never heard. When Peter challenges her authority, questioning whether Jesus would really reveal secrets to a woman that he hadn't shared with the men, Mary's response reveals the fundamental issue that would later tear early Christianity apart. The question wasn't whether women could receive divine revelation. The question was whether spiritual authority should be based on wisdom and understanding or on institutional position and social status. These alternative gospels reveal something that official church history has tried to hide for centuries. The early Christian movement included women in positions of leadership and authority that were later systematically eliminated. Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of Jesus, Salome, Joanna, and other women weren't just followers or supporters. They were apostles in their own right, carrying teachings that were considered equally valid to those of the 12 men. The Acts of Paul and Thecla, another suppressed apostolic text, tells the story of a woman who was converted by Paul's preaching and became an evangelist and teacher herself, baptizing converts and establishing Christian communities. The text presents her as having apostolic authority equal to Paul's, performing miracles and receiving divine visions that guide her ministry. But by the 2nd century, church leaders were becoming increasingly uncomfortable with these accounts of female apostolic authority. The letters attributed to Paul in the New Testament began to include passages restricting women's roles in churches, commanding them to remain silent and submit to male authority. Whether these passages were actually written by Paul or added later by editors remains a subject of scholarly debate, but their effect was clear. Women's voices were being systematically silenced. This suppression of female apostolic authority had devastating consequences that extended far beyond questions of church leadership. It eliminated entire theological perspectives that had been central to early Christian communities. The feminine wisdom traditions that appear throughout the suppressed Gospels offered ways of understanding Jesus' teachings that emphasized inner transformation, mystical experience, and direct spiritual knowledge rather than institutional authority and doctrinal conformity. The Gospel of Mary, for example, describes Jesus teaching about the nature of sin in ways that completely contradict orthodox doctrine. Instead of presenting sin as moral failure requiring external forgiveness, Jesus explains that sin is essentially a kind of spiritual ignorance that traps souls in cycles of suffering and confusion. The solution isn't faith in his sacrificial death, but awakening to the divine nature that already exists within every human being. This understanding of sin and salvation had radical implications for how Christian communities should function. If every person contained a divine spark that could be awakened through proper teaching and practice, then what need was there for priests, bishops, or institutional sacraments? If salvation came through inner knowledge rather than external authority, then the entire hierarchical structure that was emerging in the 2nd and 3rd centuries became questionable. The Apostle Judas, perhaps the most vilified figure in Christian history, also left behind texts that present a completely different understanding of his role in Jesus' story. The Gospel of Judas, discovered in the Egyptian desert and only recently translated, portrays him not as a betrayer motivated by greed or evil, but as Jesus' most trusted disciple, the only one who understood the true nature of his mission. According to this gospel, Jesus specifically chose Judas to facilitate his arrest and crucifixion because only Judas had the spiritual strength to perform such a difficult task. The text presents their conversation as Jesus prepares for his final sacrifice, with Judas expressing reluctance to participate in what seems like betrayal. Jesus reassures him that his action is necessary for the completion of the divine plan and that he will be vindicated in the future. This radically different portrayal of Judas transforms the entire meaning of the crucifixion narrative. Instead of being a tragic betrayal that leads to Jesus' death, Judas's action becomes a conscious collaboration in a cosmic drama designed to demonstrate the power of love over death, spirit over matter, and divine consciousness over earthly limitation. The implications ripple through everything we think we know about Christian origins. If Judas was actually Jesus' closest collaborator rather than his betrayer, then the traditional understanding of the crucifixion as atonement for human sin becomes questionable. Instead, it appears as a carefully orchestrated demonstration of spiritual principles that transcend physical existence. These suppressed apostolic texts reveal a form of Christianity that was far more mystical, egalitarian, and philosophically sophisticated than what emerged from the Orthodox tradition. They present teachings about the nature of consciousness, reality, and human potential that sound remarkably contemporary, addressing questions that modern psychology, neuroscience, and quantum physics are only beginning to explore. But here's what makes this historical suppression truly explosive. These alternative gospels weren't eliminated because they were obviously false or clearly heretical. They were suppressed because they threatened the institutional power structure that was consolidating control over Christian communities in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. The bishops who were establishing themselves as the sole interpreters of Christian doctrine couldn't tolerate the existence of texts that suggested every believer had direct access to divine truth. The process of elimination was systematic and ruthless. Alternative gospels were declared heretical. Communities that preserved them were persecuted. Leaders who taught from them were excommunicated or worse. By the 4th century, when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, the suppression campaign had been so successful that most Christians had no idea these alternative traditions had ever existed. But manuscripts have a way of surviving even the most determined efforts to destroy them. Hidden in caves, buried in desert sands, preserved in forgotten libraries, these suppressed apostolic writings waited for centuries until archaeological discovery would bring them back to light. And what they reveal about the apostles, they almost erased challenges everything we've been told about Christian origins. The story we're uncovering isn't just about ancient history or theological disputes. It's about the fundamental nature of spiritual authority and religious truth. Who gets to decide which teachings are authentic and which are dangerous? How do we distinguish between divine inspiration and human manipulation? What happens when institutional power conflicts with individual spiritual experience? These questions weren't settled in the ancient world, and they remain urgent today as we continue to discover more suppressed texts and uncover more evidence of the systematic elimination of alternative Christian traditions. The apostles they almost erased may have been silenced for centuries, but their voices are beginning to speak again. And what they have to say might transform our understanding of Christianity itself. The question of how many apostles there really were becomes even more complex when we examine texts that were deliberately excluded from the biblical canon. The traditional number 12 has become so ingrained in Christian consciousness that most people never question it. But the suppressed manuscripts reveal a far more complicated picture of Jesus' inner circle and the early Christian movement. The Gospel of the 12, fragments of which have been discovered in various locations across the Middle East, suggests that Jesus had multiple circles of disciples with varying levels of access to his teachings. The text describes an inner group of 12 who received public instruction, a smaller circle of 7 who were given deeper mysteries, and an even more intimate group of 3 who witnessed events that were never recorded in the canonical Gospels. This layered approach to discipleship appears throughout the suppressed texts, indicating that the early Christian movement was far more sophisticated in its organizational structure than Orthodox sources acknowledge. The Acts of the Apostles in the New Testament mentions only a fraction of the missionary activity that was actually taking place, focusing primarily on Paul's journeys, while ignoring entire networks of apostolic activity that were spreading throughout the ancient world. Consider the figure of Matthias, who according to Acts was chosen to replace Judas Iscariot among the 12. The canonical text gives him only a brief mention, but suppressed manuscripts reveal that he established thriving Christian communities across Africa and wrote extensively about Jesus' teachings on the nature of divine consciousness. The Gospel of Matthias, known only through fragments and references in other ancient texts, apparently contained some of the most radical theological insights in early Christian literature. The text reportedly described Jesus teaching about the multiplicity of divine emanations, suggesting that the God of the Hebrew Scriptures was only one manifestation of a much greater cosmic intelligence. This teaching was so threatening to the emerging Orthodox theology that every known copy of the Gospel of Matthias was systematically destroyed, leaving only tantalizing references in the writings of early church fathers who condemned it as dangerous heresy. Even more mysterious is the figure of Barnabas, who appears prominently in Acts as Paul's companion, but whose own apostolic authority was gradually diminished in later Christian tradition. The Epistle of Barnabas, which circulated widely in early Christian communities and was considered canonical by many churches, presents teachings that directly contradict key doctrines that would later become Orthodox dogma. The epistle describes the Hebrew scriptures as allegorical rather than literal, suggesting that the stories of the Old Testament were symbolic representations of spiritual truths rather than historical accounts. It presents Jesus not as the fulfillment of Jewish prophecy, but as a cosmic teacher whose message transcended all particular religious traditions. These ideas were so threatening to the Church's claims about its relationship to Judaism that the Epistle of Barnabas was gradually marginalized and eventually excluded from the biblical canon entirely. The suppression of Barnabas's authentic voice represents a particularly tragic loss, because his writings apparently bridged the gap between Jewish mysticism and Christian theology in ways that could have prevented centuries of anti-Semitic persecution. His understanding of Jesus' teachings emphasized their universal spiritual significance, while maintaining respect for the wisdom traditions from which they emerged. The Gospel of Bartholomew, another completely suppressed text, reportedly contained Jesus' most detailed teachings about the nature of angels, demons, and the invisible spiritual forces that influence human consciousness. According to references in ancient sources, this gospel described elaborate techniques for discerning spiritual influences and protecting oneself from malevolent entities that seek to manipulate human behavior. These teachings about spiritual warfare were apparently much more sophisticated than anything that survived in the canonical texts, providing practical methods for detecting deception and maintaining spiritual clarity in the face of psychological manipulation. The complete elimination of this gospel represents the loss of an entire dimension of early Christian spirituality that was considered essential by many apostolic communities. The systematic nature of this suppression becomes clear when we examine the fate of texts attributed to the Apostle James, the brother of Jesus. Multiple Gospels were attributed to James in the ancient world, but only one letter bearing his name survived into the biblical canon, and even that text was disputed by early church leaders who questioned its authenticity and theological value. The lost Gospels of James reportedly presented the most intimate portrait of Jesus available in early Christian literature, describing his childhood, his family relationships, and his gradual awakening to his spiritual mission. These texts apparently revealed Jesus as a fully human figure who struggled with the same questions and challenges that face every spiritual seeker, rather than the divine being who possessed complete knowledge from birth. This humanized portrait of Jesus was deeply threatening to the church leaders who were developing doctrines about his divine nature and unique relationship to God. The idea that Jesus had grown spiritually, that he had learned and developed like any other human being, undermined claims about his supernatural status that were becoming central to Orthodox theology. The Gospel of James the Just, as it was known in ancient sources, apparently contained Jesus' most radical teachings about social justice and economic equality. The text reportedly described early Christian communities as practicing complete communalism, sharing all possessions and rejecting the accumulation of private wealth as incompatible with spiritual development. These economic teachings were so threatening to the church leaders who were becoming increasingly wealthy and politically connected that every reference to them was texts. By systematically eliminated from surviving the 4th century, when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, the idea that Jesus had taught radical economic equality was so completely suppressed that it became literally unthinkable within Orthodox Christianity. The Apostle Simon, known in the canonical Gospels as Simon the Zealot, left behind texts that revealed the political dimensions of Jesus' ministry in ways that were later considered too dangerous to preserve. The Gospel of Simon reportedly described Jesus as being deeply involved in the resistance movement against Roman occupation, not as a violent revolutionary, but as a teacher who inspired people to reject the psychological and spiritual foundations of imperial domination. These teachings about liberation from oppressive systems were apparently central to early Christian communities, but they became increasingly problematic as the Church sought accommodation with Roman political power. The complete suppression of Simon's authentic voice eliminated an entire dimension of Jesus' message that emphasized the incompatibility between spiritual awakening and submission to unjust authority. The Acts of Simon and Jude, another completely lost text, reportedly contained detailed accounts of apostolic missions to India and Central Asia, regions that were later forgotten in Christian historical consciousness. These missions apparently established thriving Christian communities that developed unique theological insights through their interaction with Buddhist and Hindu spiritual traditions. The synthesis of Christian and Eastern mysticism that emerged from these encounters was apparently documented in texts that were later deemed heretical because they suggested that Jesus' teachings were compatible with non-Christian spiritual traditions. The elimination of these texts represented not just the loss of historical information, but the suppression of theological possibilities that could have prevented centuries of religious conflict and misunderstanding. The Apostle Andrew, who appears briefly in the canonical Gospels, apparently wrote extensively about the mystical experiences that were common in early Christian communities. The Gospel of Andrew, known only through hostile references in Orthodox sources, reportedly contained detailed instructions for inducing spiritual visions and direct encounters with divine consciousness. These mystical practices were apparently central to apostolic Christianity, but they became increasingly problematic as the Church developed institutional structures that required mediation through priests and bishops. The idea that ordinary believers could access divine truth directly through spiritual practice undermined the authority claims that were becoming central to ecclesiastical power. The complete elimination of Andrew's authentic teachings represents the loss of an entire tradition of Christian mysticism that was apparently much more developed and sophisticated than anything that survived in Orthodox sources. The references that remain suggest that early Christian communities had access to spiritual technologies that enabled extraordinary states of consciousness and direct perception of spiritual realities. The suppression of these mystical traditions had profound consequences for the development of Western spirituality. Instead of a religion that emphasized direct spiritual experience and inner transformation, Christianity became increasingly focused on belief in correct doctrines and submission to ecclesiastical authority. The apostolic tradition of mystical practice was driven underground, surfacing only occasionally in the writings of individual saints and mystics who often faced persecution for their spiritual insights. The Gospel of Philip the Evangelist, distinct from the Gospel of Philip attributed to the Apostle, reportedly contained the most detailed account of the role that women played in early Christian communities. This text apparently described female apostles, prophets, and teachers who were equal in authority to their male counterparts and who preserved teachings that were considered too sacred to be written down. The systematic elimination of these accounts of female apostolic authority represents one of the most tragic losses in Christian history. The suppression wasn't just about gender politics, but about the elimination of entire theological perspectives that were apparently central to early Christian spirituality, but incompatible with the patriarchal structures that the Church was adopting from Roman imperial culture. The lost writings of these erased apostles contain not just alternative theological perspectives, but practical spiritual technologies that were apparently essential to apostolic Christianity. The fragments that survive suggest that early Christian communities had access to methods for healing, prophecy, and spiritual transformation that were far more sophisticated than anything preserved in Orthodox tradition. The question that haunts every serious study of these suppressed texts is what Christianity might have become if these apostolic voices had been allowed to survive alongside the canonical tradition. Would the religion have developed differently if the mystical, egalitarian, and socially radical dimensions of Jesus' message had been preserved rather than eliminated? The archaeological evidence continues to accumulate, revealing the extent of the suppression and the sophistication of the traditions that were eliminated. Each new discovery adds to our understanding of the diversity and complexity of early Christianity, while raising new questions about the motivations behind the systematic campaign to eliminate alternative apostolic voices. The implications extend far beyond historical curiosity into contemporary questions about religious authority, spiritual experience, and the nature of divine revelation itself. The suppressed apostolic texts suggest possibilities for understanding Jesus' message that remain relevant and potentially transformative for modern seekers who are dissatisfied with conventional religious answers to ultimate questions. These erased apostles may have been silenced by institutional power, but their voices are beginning to speak again through the manuscripts that survived their systematic destruction. What they reveal about the nature of apostolic authority and authentic Christian spirituality challenges everything we thought we knew about the origins of the world's largest religion. But the most shocking discovery may be what happened to the Apostle Thomas himself. The canonical Gospels present him as Doubting Thomas, the skeptical disciple who refused to believe in Jesus' resurrection until he could touch the wounds personally. This portrayal has shaped Western understanding of Thomas for 2 millennia, painting him as the apostle of uncertainty and hesitation. Yet the suppressed texts reveal a completely different figure. The Acts of Thomas, preserved in fragments despite systematic attempts at destruction, describes him as Jesus' twin brother, not just in appearance but in spiritual understanding. The text claims that Thomas alone among the apostles fully grasped the true nature of Jesus' message about the divine spark within every human soul. According to these hidden manuscripts, Thomas traveled to India, where he established communities that practiced a form of Christianity so advanced in its mystical insights that it threatened the very foundations of institutional religion. The Gospel of Thomas, which we mentioned earlier, was apparently just one text in a vast library of Thomas literature that documented his teachings about consciousness, reality, and spiritual transformation. The Indian Christian communities that Thomas established reportedly developed practices for inducing direct spiritual experiences that made conventional religious authority obsolete. Why would you need priests to mediate between you and God if you could access divine consciousness directly through the techniques that Thomas taught? Why would you submit to church doctrine if you could verify spiritual truth through your own inner experience? The threat this posed to emerging church hierarchy cannot be overstated. The bishops who were consolidating power in the Mediterranean world couldn't tolerate the existence of Christian communities that operated according to completely different principles of spiritual authority. The systematic elimination of Thomas literature wasn't just theological housekeeping. It was the destruction of an entire alternative model for how Christianity could function. The Acts of Thomas contains passages that describe healing techniques, meditation practices, and methods for developing psychic abilities that sound more like advanced yoga instruction than anything resembling conventional Christian teaching. Thomas apparently taught that Jesus' true gift to humanity wasn't salvation through faith in his sacrifice, but awakening to the divine consciousness that was already present within every human being. This understanding of Jesus' mission had radical implications for how Christian communities should organize themselves. If everyone possessed the same divine spark that Jesus had fully realized, then spiritual authority should be based on the level of consciousness someone had achieved rather than their position in an institutional hierarchy. The most awakened practitioners would naturally become teachers, regardless of their gender, social status, or formal ordination. The Gospel of Thomas records Jesus saying, "When you make the two one, and when you make the inside like the outside, and the outside like the inside, and the above like the below, then you will enter the kingdom." This isn't the apocalyptic Christianity that expected Jesus to return and establish an earthly kingdom. This is mystical Christianity that taught the integration of consciousness and the transcendence of ordinary dualistic thinking. But Thomas wasn't the only apostle whose authentic teachings threatened institutional Christianity. The figure of Peter, traditionally considered the first pope and the rock upon which the church was built, left behind texts that present a radically different understanding of apostolic authority than what emerged in Roman Catholicism. The Gospel of Peter, fragments of which have been discovered in Egyptian archaeological sites, describes the crucifixion and resurrection from a perspective that emphasizes their symbolic rather than literal meaning. According to this text, Jesus' death and resurrection were cosmic events that demonstrated the illusory nature of physical existence and the eternal reality of divine consciousness. This interpretation made the crucifixion into a teaching about the nature of reality rather than a sacrificial atonement for human sin. Peter apparently taught that Jesus' suffering was a demonstration of how consciousness could transcend physical limitation, rather than a payment required by divine justice for human moral failure. The Acts of Peter, another suppressed apostolic text, contains accounts of spiritual powers and mystical experiences that were apparently common in early Christian communities, but became increasingly problematic as the church developed more conventional theological frameworks. The text describes Peter performing healings, raising the dead, and demonstrating mastery over natural laws that suggest early Christians had access to abilities that would later be dismissed as impossible or heretical. Most shocking of all, the Acts of Peter contains a detailed account of Peter's confrontation with Simon Magus, a rival teacher who claimed to possess superior spiritual powers. According to the suppressed text, this wasn't just a conflict between good and evil, but a demonstration of two completely different approaches to spiritual development. Simon represented the path of seeking power over others through the application of divine, while Peter demonstrated the path of serving between Peter and Simon, apparently love. The contest involved public demonstrations of abilities that transcended ordinary physical laws, including levitation, healing at a distance, and the manipulation of matter through conscious intention. These accounts were so problematic for later church leaders, who wanted to distance Christianity from anything resembling magic or occultism, that they were systematically eliminated from Orthodox tradition. The suppression of Peter's authentic teachings represents a particularly tragic irony in Christian history. The apostle who supposedly established the institutional church apparently taught principles that were completely incompatible with institutional religious authority. His emphasis on direct spiritual experience and the development of consciousness-based abilities was gradually replaced by doctrines about faith, obedience, and submission to ecclesiastical hierarchy. The Gospel of the Hebrews, attributed to the Apostle Matthew but written in Aramaic rather than Greek, apparently contained Jesus' most detailed teachings about the relationship between spiritual development and social justice. This text was widely circulated in early Jewish Christian communities and was considered authentic by many church fathers, but it was gradually marginalized because its social and economic teachings were too radical for the church's accommodation with Roman power structures. The Gospel reportedly described Jesus teaching that spiritual awakening was impossible while participating in systems of economic oppression. According to fragments that survive in quotations by early Christian writers, Jesus apparently taught that accumulating wealth beyond what was necessary for basic survival was incompatible with the consciousness transformation that he called the kingdom of heaven. These economic teachings were so threatening to church leaders who were becoming increasingly wealthy and politically connected that the entire gospel of the Hebrews was systematically eliminated from Christian tradition. By the 4th century, when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, the idea that Jesus had taught radical economic equality was so completely suppressed that it became literally unthinkable within Orthodox Christianity. The Apostle John, traditionally considered the author of the most mystical of the canonical Gospels, apparently wrote additional texts that were even more explicit about the nature of consciousness and reality. The secret book of John, discovered among the Nag Hammadi manuscripts, presents cosmological teachings that describe reality as consisting of multiple dimensions of consciousness, with the material world representing only the densest and most limited level of existence. According to this text, John received these teachings through direct visionary experience after Jesus' resurrection, when the risen Christ appeared to him and revealed the hidden structure of reality. The teachings describe how consciousness becomes trapped in material existence through identification with the physical body and mental conditioning, and how it can be liberated through proper understanding and spiritual practice. The secret book of John contains detailed maps of consciousness that describe different levels of spiritual development and the specific challenges that seekers encounter at each stage of awakening. These psychological insights were apparently central to early Christian spiritual direction, but they became increasingly problematic as the Church developed more simplified doctrinal frameworks that emphasized belief rather than direct spiritual experience. The systematic elimination of John's advanced teachings represents the loss of an entire science of consciousness that was apparently essential to apostolic Christianity. The fragments that survive suggest that early Christian communities possessed sophisticated understanding of how consciousness functions and how it can be transformed through specific practices and insights. The Apostle James, known as James the Just and identified as Jesus' brother, established Christian communities in Jerusalem that practiced a form of Judaism-influenced Christianity so different from what emerged in the Greek-speaking world that it was eventually declared heretical by the Church that claimed to follow Jesus' teachings. The Gospel of James, completely eliminated from Christian tradition, apparently presented the most authentic account available of Jesus' actual family background and the Jewish context of his teachings. This text reportedly revealed that Jesus' message was deeply rooted in Jewish mystical traditions and that his innovations were developments of existing spiritual practices rather than completely new revelations. The suppression of James's authentic voice eliminated the Jewish dimension of Christianity so completely that the religion became almost entirely Hellenized, losing its connection to the wisdom traditions from which it had originally emerged. This cultural transformation wasn't just about language and customs, but about fundamental approaches to spiritual development and religious authority. James apparently taught that Jesus' significance lay not in his unique divine nature, but in his complete realization of the divine potential that existed within every human being. This understanding made Jesus into a teacher and example rather than an object of worship, fundamentally changing how Christians should relate to his message and his person. The letter of James that survived into the biblical canon contains only hints of these more radical teachings, focusing primarily on practical ethics, rather than the mystical insights that were apparently central to his Jerusalem community. The authentic James taught sophisticated practices for developing the spiritual faculties that Jesus had demonstrated. But these techniques were systematically eliminated because they made institutional religious authority unnecessary. The Apostle Jude, traditionally identified as another brother of Jesus, wrote texts that apparently contained some of the most advanced teachings about spiritual warfare and protection from malevolent influences that were available in early Christian literature. The Epistle of Jude in the biblical canon mentions these teachings only briefly, referring to disputes with spiritual entities that most modern readers find incomprehensible. The complete writings of Jude, known only through references in other ancient texts, apparently provided detailed instruction for recognizing and countering psychological manipulation by entities that exist in non-physical dimensions of reality. These teachings were central to early Christian spiritual practice, but they became increasingly problematic as the Church developed more conventional theological frameworks. The elimination of Jude's authentic teachings left early Christians vulnerable to exactly the kind of spiritual deception that he had warned against. The sophisticated understanding of consciousness and spiritual influence that was apparently common in apostolic communities was replaced by simpler doctrinal formulations that offered little practical guidance for navigating the psychological complexities of spiritual development. The Apostle Philip, distinct from Philip the Evangelist, apparently established communities in Asia Minor that developed the most advanced understanding of the relationship between consciousness and physical reality that existed in the ancient world. The Gospel of Philip, which we discussed earlier, was apparently just one text in a vast literature that documented these communities' insights into the nature of existence itself. The complete Philip literature, almost entirely eliminated from Christian tradition, reportedly contained detailed explanations of how consciousness creates the appearance of material reality and how spiritual practice can reveal the illusory nature of physical limitation. These teachings were so far ahead of their time that they wouldn't be rediscovered until the development of modern psychology and quantum physics. The systematic suppression of Philip's authentic teachings eliminated an entire dimension of early Christian spirituality that understood the relationship between mind and matter in ways that conventional religion couldn't accommodate. The communities that Philip established apparently developed abilities that transcended ordinary physical laws, but these achievements were systematically reinterpreted as demonic deception rather than authentic spiritual development. The Apostle Matthias, chosen to replace Judas among the 12, established communities in Africa that apparently preserved the most complete collection of Jesus' private teachings that existed in the ancient world. The Gospel of Matthias, completely eliminated from Christian tradition, reportedly contained instructions for spiritual practices that could induce the same state of consciousness that Jesus himself had achieved. According to references in hostile Orthodox sources, the Gospel of Matthias taught that every human being was capable of achieving the same level of spiritual realization that Jesus had demonstrated. This understanding made Jesus into a pioneer and teacher rather than a unique divine being, fundamentally altering how Christians should understand both his message and their own spiritual potential. The African communities that Matthias established apparently developed forms of Christian spirituality that integrated indigenous wisdom traditions with Jesus' teachings, creating synthesis approaches that were far more sophisticated than the Greek philosophical frameworks that dominated Mediterranean Christianity. The complete elimination of these traditions represents an incalculable loss of spiritual wisdom and cultural diversity. The Gospel of Matthias reportedly contained the most detailed account of Jesus' childhood and early spiritual development that existed in ancient Christian literature. According to fragments preserved in hostile quotations, the text described Jesus' gradual awakening to his spiritual mission through encounters with various wisdom teachers and mystical experiences that shaped his understanding of consciousness and reality. This humanized portrait of Jesus as a seeker who developed spiritually over time was deeply threatening to church leaders who were developing doctrines about his divine nature and pre-existence. The idea that Jesus had grown and learned like any other human being undermined theological claims that were becoming central to Orthodox Christianity. The systematic elimination of these alternative apostolic voices wasn't just about theological disagreements or institutional politics. It was about fundamentally different understandings of what Christianity was supposed to accomplish and how spiritual communities should function. The apostolic traditions that were suppressed emphasized direct spiritual experience, consciousness transformation, and the development of abilities that transcended ordinary human limitations. The Christianity that survived emphasized faith in correct doctrines, submission to ecclesiastical authority, and the postponement of spiritual fulfillment to an afterlife existence. These weren't just different interpretations of the same basic message. They were completely different approaches to spiritual development and religious life. The archaeological evidence continues to accumulate, revealing the extent of the suppression and the sophistication of the traditions that were eliminated. Recent discoveries in Syria, Egypt, and Central Asia have uncovered Christian communities that preserved apostolic teachings well into the medieval period, sometimes in forms so different from Orthodox Christianity that scholars initially failed to recognize them as Christian at all. Computer analysis of ancient manuscripts is revealing layers of editing and revision that show how apostolic texts were gradually modified to conform to orthodox theological positions. Passages that emphasized direct spiritual experience were deleted or reinterpreted. References to consciousness-based abilities were eliminated or explained away. Teachings about the divine nature of human consciousness were systematically obscured or contradicted. Carbon dating and other scientific techniques continue to confirm that many of the suppressed apostolic texts are actually older than parts of the New Testament, undermining Orthodox claims that they were later fabrications created by heretical groups. The evidence increasingly suggests that what we consider mainstream Christianity was actually a minority position that achieved dominance through political power rather than spiritual authenticity. The implications of this historical suppression extend far beyond academic curiosity into contemporary questions about religious authority, spiritual development, and human potential itself. The apostolic traditions that were eliminated contained practical wisdom for consciousness transformation that remains relevant for modern seekers who are dissatisfied with conventional religious answers to ultimate questions. These suppressed teachings offer resources for understanding the relationship between spirituality and psychology, consciousness and reality, individual development and social transformation that aren't available in orthodox religious traditions. They point toward possibilities for human development that have been forgotten or dismissed as impossible by cultures that have accepted the limitations imposed by materialistic worldviews. The apostles they almost erased may have been silenced by institutional power, but their teachings about consciousness, reality, and human potential continue to resurface in forms adapted to contemporary understanding. The wisdom they preserved offers pathways for spiritual development that transcend the boundaries between religious traditions while remaining true to the essential insights that Jesus himself demonstrated. The question investigation of these suppressed traditions that haunts every serious is what humanity lost when these apostolic voices were systematically eliminated from Christian consciousness. The evidence suggests that early Christianity possessed understanding of consciousness and spiritual development that was far more advanced than anything that survived in Orthodox tradition. The gradual recovery of these suppressed teachings through archaeological discovery and scholarly research represents an opportunity to reclaim aspects of human spiritual heritage that were thought to be lost forever. But it also raises disturbing questions about how much other wisdom has been eliminated by those who found alternative perspectives threatening to their authority. The deeper you dig into these suppressed apostolic traditions, the more you realize that what was eliminated wasn't just alternative theology. It was an entire understanding of human consciousness and spiritual development that threatened the very foundations of institutional religion. These weren't minor disagreements about doctrine. These were fundamentally different visions of what it means to be human and what spiritual awakening actually involves. Consider what happened to the teachings of the Apostle Thaddeus, also known as Jude Thaddeus, whose authentic writings were so completely suppressed that most Christians today don't even know he existed as a distinct figure from Jude, the brother of Jesus. The Acts of Thaddeus, known only through fragments preserved in hostile quotations, apparently contained the most detailed instructions for developing what the text called the spiritual senses that were available in early Christian literature. According to these fragments, Thaddeus taught that human beings possessed latent faculties of perception that could be awakened through specific practices involving breath, attention, and inner visualization. These weren't just metaphorical descriptions of faith or devotion. They were precise instructions for developing abilities that would allow practitioners to perceive spiritual realities directly rather than having to accept them on faith. The elimination of Thaddeus's teachings represents the loss of an entire technology of consciousness that was apparently central to apostolic Christianity. Instead of a religion that helped people develop their spiritual faculties, Christianity became a system that required people to suppress their direct experience in favor of accepting authoritative doctrines. But perhaps the most shocking suppression involved the figure of Matthias, whose selection to replace Judas among the 12 is mentioned briefly in Acts, but whose actual teachings were so completely eliminated that even their existence was forgotten. Recent archaeological discoveries in Ethiopia have uncovered fragments of texts that may represent portions of the lost gospel of Matthias, and what they reveal is absolutely staggering. These fragments describe Jesus teaching about the nature of time and causality in ways that sound more like advanced physics than ancient religion. According to these texts, Jesus apparently taught that linear time was an illusion created by limited consciousness, and that awakened awareness could perceive the eternal present that underlies all temporal experience. The practical implications of this teaching were enormous. If time was indeed illusory, then death wasn't a real event, but simply a transition between different states of consciousness. If causality operated differently than ordinary perception suggested, then healing and other miraculous phenomena weren't violations of natural law, but applications of deeper principles that transcended material limitation. The Gospel of Matthias apparently contained detailed instructions for developing this expanded perception of time and causality. Practitioners were taught specific meditation techniques that could induce experiences of temporal transcendence, allowing them to perceive past and future events as simultaneously present in consciousness. These teachings were so far beyond anything that conventional religion could accommodate that they were systematically eliminated not just from Christian tradition, but from human consciousness itself. The very possibility of such experiences was declared impossible, leaving generations of seekers without access to practices that had been considered essential to apostolic spirituality. The suppression becomes even more sinister when you examine what happened to the writings of Bartholomew, whose gospel was apparently the most comprehensive guide to understanding the invisible forces that influence human consciousness that existed in the ancient world. The Gospel of Bartholomew, completely eliminated from Christian tradition, reportedly provided detailed maps of what we might now call the psychological and psychic dimensions of reality. According to references in early Christian writings, this gospel described different categories of non-physical entities that could influence human thoughts and emotions, along with specific techniques for recognizing and protecting oneself from harmful influences. But this wasn't primitive demonology or superstitious fear of evil spirits. It was apparently sophisticated understanding of how consciousness functions at levels that transcend ordinary awareness. The text reportedly distinguished between influences that sought to expand consciousness and those that sought to limit it, providing practical criteria for discerning which spiritual experiences were authentic and which were deceptive. This kind of discrimination was apparently essential to early Christian spiritual practice, but it became increasingly problematic as the Church developed more simplified frameworks that couldn't accommodate such psychological sophistication. The complete elimination of Bartholomew's teachings left Christians vulnerable to exactly the kind of spiritual manipulation that he had warned against. The practical wisdom for navigating the complexities of consciousness development was replaced by crude doctrinal formulations that offered little guidance for distinguishing between authentic spiritual experience and psychological delusion. Even more tragic is what happened to the authentic teachings of Simon Peter, whose canonical letters bear little resemblance to the sophisticated spiritual instruction that he apparently provided to early Christian communities. The secret teachings of Peter, known only through references in texts that were themselves later suppressed, reportedly contained the most advanced understanding of the relationship between individual consciousness and cosmic intelligence that was available in the apostolic period. These teachings apparently described consciousness not as something produced by the brain, but as the fundamental fabric of reality itself. Individual awareness was understood as localized expressions of universal intelligence that could expand to encompass increasingly broader dimensions of existence through proper spiritual practice. The secret teachings of Peter reportedly provided detailed instructions for what the text called cosmic consciousness, states of awareness in which the boundaries between self and universe dissolved into direct perception of the underlying unity that connects all existence. These weren't just mystical experiences, but practical abilities that could be developed through specific techniques involving meditation, contemplation, and inner purification. The systematic suppression of Peter's advanced teachings represents one of the greatest losses in human spiritual history. Instead of a Christianity that helped people develop cosmic consciousness, the religion became focused on maintaining psychological separation between believers and the divine reality they were supposedly worshiping. The figure of Andrew presents perhaps the most mysterious case of apostolic suppression, because virtually nothing of his authentic teachings survived even in fragmentary form. The Gospel of Andrew was apparently so completely eliminated that even hostile references to it were systematically removed from early Christian writings. The few hints that remain suggest that Andrew specialized in what the ancient texts called the science of resurrection, practices that could induce experiences of conscious continuity beyond physical death. According to these obscure references, Andrew taught that death was fundamentally a psychological event rather than a biological one, and that consciousness properly prepared could maintain complete continuity of awareness throughout the transition. The Gospel of Andrew apparently contained detailed instructions for developing this preparation, including specific practices that could be performed during the dying process itself. These teachings about conscious death were apparently central to early Christian spirituality, but they became increasingly problematic as the Church developed doctrines about afterlife existence that required acceptance on faith rather than direct preparation and experience. The elimination of Andrew's authentic voice left Christians without practical guidance for the most significant transition that every human being must face. The Apostle Philip the Evangelist, distinct from Philip the Apostle, established communities throughout Asia Minor that apparently developed the most sophisticated understanding of healing and psychosomatic medicine that existed in the ancient world. The Acts of Philip, preserved only in heavily edited versions, originally contained detailed explanations of how consciousness could directly influence physical health and biological processes. According to the fragments that survive, Philip taught that most illness originated in distorted patterns of thought and emotion that created corresponding disturbances in the physical body. Healing wasn't just a matter of divine intervention, but involved specific techniques for correcting these psychological imbalances and restoring the natural harmony between mind and body. The complete Philip literature apparently included precise nosing the instructions for diag psychological roots of various physical conditions and detailed protocols for addressing them through what we might now call psychosomatic therapy. These weren't just general principles, but specific techniques that could be learned and applied systematically. The suppression of Philip's medical teachings represents an incalculable loss to human health and well-being. Instead of a Christianity that understood the intimate connection between consciousness and physical vitality, the religion developed increasingly dualistic attitudes that separated spiritual and material existence in ways that made holistic healing impossible. But perhaps the most shocking discovery involves what recent scholarship has revealed about the Apostle Thomas's mission to India and the established there. The complete Christian communities that he Acts of Thomas, preserved in fragments despite systematic attempts at destruction, apparently documented the development of Christian spiritual practices that integrated Jesus' teachings with advanced yogic techniques that had been preserved in Indian wisdom traditions for millennia. These Indian Christian communities apparently achieved levels of spiritual development that were unprecedented in the Mediterranean world. The Acts of Thomas describes practitioners who had developed abilities that transcended ordinary physical limitations, including conscious control of biological processes, perception of distant events, and direct communication between minds without spoken language. The text apparently provided detailed instructions for developing these abilities through practices that combined Christian contemplation with sophisticated techniques for controlling breath, attention, and subtle energies within the body. These weren't just theoretical descriptions, but practical manuals that enabled systematic spiritual development. The systematic suppression of the Thomas literature eliminated an entire dimension of Christian spirituality that understood the relationship between Jesus' teachings and the advanced consciousness technologies that had been preserved in Eastern traditions. Instead of a Christianity that could integrate the best insights from all wisdom traditions, the religion became increasingly isolated and defensive about its unique claims. The Gospel of the Hebrews, attributed to the Apostle Matthew and written in the language that Jesus himself spoke, apparently contained the most authentic record of Jesus' actual words that was available in early Christian literature. This text was widely circulated in Jewish Christian communities and was considered authoritative by many church fathers, but it was gradually suppressed because its social and economic teachings were incompatible with the Church's accommodation to Roman imperial power. According to fragments that survive in quotations by early Christian writers, the Gospel of the Hebrews presented Jesus as teaching that spiritual awakening was impossible while participating in systems of economic exploitation. The text apparently contained detailed instructions for creating alternative economic arrangements based on principles of mutual aid and resource sharing, rather than individual accumulation and competitive advantage. These economic teachings weren't just idealistic visions of how society should function, but practical guidelines for organizing Christian transformation reflected the consciousness communities according to principles that Jesus called the kingdom of heaven. The communities that followed apparently achieved these guidelines and levels of social harmony and material well-being that demonstrated the practical effectiveness of Jesus' social vision. The complete suppression of the Gospel of the Hebrews eliminated the economic dimension of Jesus' teachings so thoroughly that most Christians today have no idea that he taught anything significant about material relationships and social organization. Instead of a Christianity that provided practical guidance for creating just and sustainable communities, the religion became focused primarily on individual salvation and afterlife rewards. The secret book of James, discovered among the Nag Hammadi manuscripts, but representing only a fragment of a much larger literature, advanced teachings about the nature of consciousness, and to this, apparently contained Jesus' reality. According to most text, James, its relationship to physical, received these teachings through Enshin, when revealed hidden dimensions of existence that couldn't be commune reality, as consisting of multiple levels cicated through ordinary language of consciousness, with the secret book of James describes material existence representing onlyest and most limited dimension, the dens of a vast spectrum of awareness that extends infinitely beyond physical perception. The text apparently provided detailed maps of these consciousness instructions for developing levels and the spiritual sophisticated practices for what faculties necessary to explore them directly. According the text called Conscious to the Fragments That Survive, James taught projection, the ability to maintain full awareness while experiencing dimensions of reality that transcend physical limitation. These weren't just meditative experiences, but actual explorations of consciousness realms that possess their own coherent structures and inhabitants. The systematic elimination of James's advanced teachings represents the loss of an entire science of consciousness that was apparently central to apostolic Christianity. The fragments that remain suggest that early Christian communities possessed understanding of awareness and reality that wouldn't be rediscovered until the development of modern consciousness research and quantum physics. The Apostle John, traditionally considered the author of the most mystical canonical gospel, apparently wrote additional texts that were even more explicit about the practical techniques for developing the spiritual states that his canonical writings only hint at. The secret mysteries of John, known only through hostile references in Orthodox sources, reportedly contained step-by-step instructions for achieving the unity consciousness that John described as eternal life. According to these references, the secret mysteries provided specific meditation techniques, visualization practices, and methods for what the text called divine identification, states of awareness in which individual consciousness merged completely with universal intelligence. These weren't just temporary mystical experiences, but permanent transformations of identity that fundamentally altered how practitioners experienced themselves and reality. The complete elimination of John's practical teachings left Christians with inspiring descriptions of mystical states, but no guidance for actually achieving them. Instead of a Christianity that provided systematic instruction for spiritual development, the religion became focused on believing correct doctrines about mystical realities rather than experiencing them directly. The Gospel of Mary reveals perhaps the most shocking suppression of all, because it demonstrates how the early church systematically eliminated not just alternative teachings, but entire categories of spiritual authority that were apparently central to Jesus' original community. Mary Magdalene wasn't just one disciple among many. According to multiple independent sources, she was Jesus' primary spiritual heir, the one who received his deepest teachings about consciousness and reality. The complete Gospel of Mary, preserved only in fragments despite systematic attempts at destruction, apparently contained Jesus' most advanced instructions for what the text called soul development, practices that could enable individual consciousness to transcend the limitations of physical existence while remaining fully engaged with material life. These teachings weren't just about preparing for death or achieving afterlife rewards, but about transforming the quality of awareness itself so that ordinary experience became infused with divine consciousness. Mary apparently became the master teacher of these practices, establishing communities throughout the Mediterranean world that achieved extraordinary levels of spiritual development. The systematic suppression of Mary's authentic authority eliminated the feminine dimension of Christian spirituality so completely that most Christians today have no idea that Jesus taught anything significant about the relationship between gender and consciousness. Instead of a Christianity that understood the complementary roles of masculine and feminine principles in spiritual development, the religion became increasingly patriarchal and hostile to feminine wisdom. The archaeological evidence continues to accumulate, revealing the extent of the suppression and the sophistication of the traditions that were eliminated. Recent discoveries in Syria, Turkey, and Central Asia have uncovered Christian communities that preserved apostolic teachings well into the medieval period, sometimes in forms so different from Orthodox Christianity that scholars initially failed to recognize them as Christian at all. Digital analysis of ancient manuscripts is revealing layers of editing and revision that show how apostolic texts were gradually modified to conform to orthodox theological positions. Advanced imaging techniques can now detect original text that was erased and written over, revealing systematic campaigns to eliminate teachings that were considered threatening to institutional authority. Carbon dating and linguistic analysis continue to confirm that many of the suppressed apostolic texts are actually older than parts of the New Testament, undermining Orthodox claims that they were later fabrications created by heretical groups. The evidence increasingly suggests that what we consider mainstream Christianity was actually a minority position that achieved dominance through political power rather than spiritual authenticity. Computer modeling of textual relationships is revealing connections between suppressed apostolic writings that suggest they were part of a coherent alternative tradition rather than isolated heretical innovations. The suppressed texts reference each other, build upon common themes, and develop consistent approaches to spiritual development that indicate they emerged from authentic apostolic communities rather than later theological speculation. Most disturbing of all, recent scholarship has revealed that the suppression wasn't just about eliminating alternative interpretations of Jesus' message, but about systematically destroying practical knowledge that could enable individual spiritual development without institutional mediation. The suppressed texts consistently emphasize direct experience, personal transformation, and the development of consciousness abilities that would make conventional religious authority obsolete. The implications extend far beyond historical curiosity into contemporary questions about human potential, consciousness development, and spiritual authority itself. The apostolic traditions that were eliminated contained practical wisdom for awareness transformation that remains relevant for modern seekers who are dissatisfied with conventional religious answers to ultimate questions about existence and meaning. These suppressed teachings offer resources for understanding the relationship between spirituality and psychology, consciousness and reality, individual development and social transformation that aren't available in orthodox religious traditions or secular academic disciplines. They point toward possibilities for human development that have been forgotten or dismissed as impossible by cultures that have accepted the limitations imposed by materialistic and institutionally controlled worldviews. The recovery of these suppressed apostolic voices through archaeological discovery and scholarly research represents an opportunity to reclaim aspects of human spiritual heritage that were thought to be lost forever. But it also reveals the extent to which institutional power has shaped human consciousness by eliminating alternatives that might threaten established authority structures. The apostles they almost erased possessed knowledge about consciousness, reality, and human potential that was systematically eliminated because it empowered individuals rather than institutions. Their teachings about direct spiritual experience, consciousness transformation, and the development of abilities that transcend ordinary limitation represent resources for human development that have been unavailable to Western civilization for over 15 centuries. The gradual recovery of these teachings through manuscript discovery and translation is beginning to reveal the full scope of what was lost when alternative apostolic voices were systematically silenced. Each new discovery adds to our understanding of early Christian diversity while raising new questions about what other wisdom traditions have been eliminated by those who found alternative perspectives threatening to their control over human consciousness and spiritual development. But the most profound implications may concern what these discoveries reveal about the nature of spiritual authority itself. The suppressed apostolic texts consistently present a model of religious life based on individual development, direct experience, and the cultivation of consciousness abilities rather than institutional hierarchy, doctrinal conformity, and submission to external authority. This alternative model wasn't just theoretically different from what emerged as Orthodox Christianity. It produced communities that achieved levels of spiritual development, social harmony, and practical wisdom that demonstrated its effectiveness as a path for human transformation and collective evolution. The systematic elimination of these alternative apostolic voices represents not just historical suppression, but the ongoing impoverishment of human potential itself. The recovery of their teachings offers possibilities for consciousness development and spiritual growth that could transform how we understand the very nature of human existence and our relationship to the divine intelligence that underlies all reality. The question that emerges from examining these suppressed apostolic traditions becomes impossible to ignore. If the Church systematically eliminated teachings that emphasize direct spiritual experience and individual consciousness development, what does that tell us about the true nature of the conflict that shaped early Christianity? This wasn't just about theology or biblical interpretation. This was about fundamentally different visions of what it means to be human and how spiritual communities should function. The evidence suggests that the apostolic Christianity that was suppressed possessed understanding of consciousness and reality that was centuries ahead of its time. These weren't primitive religious communities struggling with basic survival. They were sophisticated spiritual laboratories that had developed technologies of awareness transformation that we're only beginning to rediscover through modern neuroscience and consciousness research. Consider what the complete elimination of these traditions has cost human civilization. For over 1,500 years, Western culture has developed under the assumption that spiritual development requires institutional mediation, that divine truth comes through external authority rather than inner experience, that human consciousness is fundamentally limited and fallen rather than inherently divine and capable of unlimited expansion. The suppressed apostolic texts reveal communities that operated according to completely different assumptions. They understood consciousness as the fundamental fabric of reality itself. They developed practices that could systematically expand awareness beyond ordinary limitations. They achieved states of individual and collective development that demonstrated human potential far exceeding what our culture typically imagines possible. The systematic destruction of this knowledge wasn't just about protecting religious orthodoxy. It was about maintaining systems of social control that depend on people accepting external authority rather than developing their own direct access to truth and wisdom. The apostolic communities that were eliminated represented an existential threat to all forms of hierarchical domination because they proved that human beings could function effectively without requiring external management of their spiritual and psychological development. The fragments that survived this systematic suppression continue to surface in archaeological discoveries that reveal the true scope of what was lost. Recent excavations in remote monasteries have uncovered caches of manuscripts that were hidden away by monks who recognized their value even when official church doctrine declared them heretical. These texts contain practical instructions for developing abilities that Orthodox Christianity has always claimed were impossible or demonic. The Gospel of Nicodemus, preserved in multiple ancient languages despite systematic attempts at elimination, describes Jesus teaching advanced techniques for what the text calls conscious dying and resurrection. According to this suppressed gospel, death wasn't an event that happened to consciousness, but a transition that awakened awareness could navigate with complete continuity and control. The text apparently provided detailed preparation practices that could enable practitioners to maintain full consciousness throughout the dying process and beyond. These weren't just beliefs about afterlife existence, but practical technologies for consciousness continuity that could be developed and tested during physical life through specific meditation and visualization techniques. The elimination of these death preparation practices left Western civilization without practical guidance for humanity's most universal experience. Instead of understanding death as a conscious transition that could be navigated skillfully, the culture developed attitudes of fear and helplessness that have shaped everything from medical practice to social organization around death denial and the desperate attempt to avoid the inevitable. The Acts of John the Divine, another completely suppressed text, reportedly contained the most advanced teachings about what early Christians called the light body, a subtle energy structure that could be developed through specific practices and eventually separated from the physical form at will. This wasn't just metaphorical language about spiritual states, but precise instruction for developing abilities that transcended ordinary biological limitations. According to fragments preserved in hostile quotations, the text described how consciousness could learn to function independently of the physical brain, accessing information and influencing events at distances that defied conventional understanding of space and time. These abilities weren't considered miraculous interventions by external divine power, but natural developments of consciousness properly trained and expanded. The systematic suppression of these light body teachings eliminated an entire dimension of human potential that was apparently central to apostolic spirituality. Instead of understanding human beings as multidimensional consciousness, capable of functioning at various levels of reality, the culture developed mechanistic models that reduced awareness to brain chemistry and dismissed experiences that transcended physical limitation as hallucination or delusion. The Gospel of the Egyptians, preserved only in fragments despite its wide circulation in early Christian communities, apparently contained Jesus' most detailed teachings about the relationship between individual consciousness and planetary intelligence. According to ancient sources, this text described Earth itself as a living conscious entity that could communicate directly with human awareness through specific practices involving what the text called terrestrial communion. These teachings about conscious relationship with planetary intelligence were apparently central to early Christian environmental understanding, but they became increasingly problematic as the Church developed more anthropocentric theological frameworks that separated humanity from natural systems, rather than recognizing the intimate interconnection between human consciousness and ecological health. The complete elimination of these ecological teachings contributed to the development of attitudes toward nature that have created the environmental crisis threatening human survival today. Instead of understanding human beings as conscious participants in planetary evolution, Western civilization developed exploitative relationships with natural systems that treated the Earth as dead matter to be dominated rather than living intelligence to be respected and collaborated with. The secret gospel of Mark, mentioned by early church fathers but systematically eliminated from Christian tradition, apparently contained Jesus' most explicit teachings about what the text called spiritual marriage, practices that could unite individual consciousness with universal intelligence through specific techniques involving both solitary meditation and partnership work between spiritually advanced practitioners. According to hostile references in Orthodox sources, this gospel described intimate spiritual practices that could dissolve the boundaries between separate selves and induce direct experience of cosmic consciousness. These weren't just theoretical descriptions of mystical states, but practical instructions for achieving union with divine intelligence through systematic consciousness development. The suppression of these spiritual marriage teachings eliminated understanding of how intimate relationship could become a path for transcending individual limitation and accessing expanded states of awareness. Instead of recognizing sexuality and partnership as potential doorways to divine consciousness, Christian culture developed increasingly repressive attitudes that treated physical intimacy as spiritually dangerous rather than potentially transformative. The Acts of Andrew and Matthew, preserved only in heavily edited versions that eliminate most of the practical content, originally contained detailed instructions for what early Christians called apostolic healing, techniques that could address not just physical symptoms, but the consciousness distortions that created illness at psychological and spiritual levels. According to the fragments that survive, these apostolic healing methods involved systematic diagnosis of the mental and emotional patterns that manifested as physical disease, followed by specific practices for correcting these distortions through consciousness transformation rather than external medical intervention. The healers were trained to perceive the subtle energy patterns that connected psychological states with biological processes. The elimination of these apostolic healing teachings left Western civilization without understanding of the intimate relationship between consciousness and health. Instead of developing medical practices that addressed the psychological roots of physical disease, the culture created increasingly mechanistic approaches that treated symptoms while ignoring the consciousness factors that generated them. The Gospel of Eve, mentioned in ancient catalogs but completely eliminated from surviving manuscripts, apparently contained the most advanced teachings about feminine wisdom and the role of divine feminine consciousness in spiritual development. According to references in early Christian writings, this text described specific practices for awakening what it called the Sophia principle, the feminine aspect of divine intelligence that was necessary for complete spiritual realization. The systematic suppression of feminine wisdom teachings eliminated half of the spiritual equation from Christian consciousness. Instead of understanding spiritual development as requiring the integration of both masculine and feminine principles, the religion became increasingly focused on masculine approaches that emphasized rational analysis and hierarchical authority while suppressing intuitive wisdom and collaborative spiritual practices. This gender imbalance wasn't just about social organization, but about fundamental approaches to consciousness development itself. The suppressed feminine wisdom traditions apparently possessed understanding of awareness transformation that operated through different principles than masculine approaches, offering complementary pathways to spiritual realization that were necessary for complete human development. The Acts of Bartholomew and Philip, preserved only in fragments that hint at the sophistication of the complete texts, apparently documented the most advanced understanding of group consciousness and collective spiritual development that existed in early Christian communities. These texts described how individual practitioners could merge their awareness into unified group intelligence that possessed capabilities far exceeding what any single person could achieve. According to the surviving fragments, these apostolic communities developed specific techniques for creating what they called apostolic consciousness, states of group awareness that could access information, influence events, and solve problems through collective intelligence that transcended individual limitation. These weren't just social cooperation, but actual merging of consciousness into unified field awareness. The elimination of these group consciousness teachings left Western civilization without understanding of how collective intelligence could be developed and utilized for solving complex problems that exceeded individual capacity. Instead of learning to function as conscious communities, human societies remained trapped in competitive individualism that prevented the emergence of genuine collective wisdom. The secret teachings of Judas Iscariot, known only through hostile references that were themselves later suppressed, apparently contained the most profound understanding of sacrifice and service that existed in apostolic literature. According to these obscure references, Judas taught that true spiritual development required complete surrender of personal will to divine intelligence, not as submission to external authority, but as conscious alignment with cosmic purpose. The text reportedly described specific practices for what it called ego death and divine rebirth, systematic methods for dissolving the psychological patterns that maintained separation from universal consciousness. These practices were apparently so advanced that they could only be undertaken by students who had already achieved significant levels of spiritual development through other means. The complete suppression of Judas's authentic teachings eliminated understanding of the most advanced stages of spiritual development from Christian consciousness. Instead of recognizing that complete surrender to divine will was the ultimate achievement of the spiritual path, the religion became focused on maintaining ego boundaries and individual identity even within relationship to God. The Acts of the Holy Women, a collection of texts documenting the teachings and achievements of female apostolic figures, was so completely eliminated that even its existence was forgotten until recent archaeological discoveries revealed fragments in remote monastery libraries. These texts apparently contained the most complete documentation of women's spiritual authority and teaching methods that existed in early Christian communities. According to the fragments that survive, the female apostles developed approaches to consciousness transformation that were specifically adapted to feminine psychology and physiology. Their methods involved working with natural cycles, intuitive wisdom, and collaborative spiritual practices that created supportive environments for deep inner work. The systematic elimination of female apostolic voices eliminated entire dimensions of spiritual wisdom that were apparently essential for complete understanding of Jesus' message. The fragments suggest that the two consciousness development were complementary rather than male and female approaches competitive, offering different pathways to the same ultimate realization of divine consciousness. The recovery of these suppressed apostolic traditions through archaeological discovery and scholarly research is revealing the true scope of what was lost when institutional Christianity eliminated its competitors. Each new manuscript discovery adds to our understanding of the diversity and sophistication of early Christian communities while raising disturbing questions about what other wisdom traditions have been systematically destroyed. But perhaps the most significant implication concerns what these discoveries reveal about human consciousness itself. The suppressed apostolic texts consistently describe abilities and experiences that mainstream culture considers impossible or delusional. Yet the systematic nature of these accounts across multiple independent sources suggests that early Christian communities had regular access to states of awareness and capabilities that transcended ordinary human limitation. The practical instructions contained in these texts aren't just ancient curiosities, but potentially functional technologies for consciousness development that could be tested and verified by contemporary practitioners. The meditation techniques, energy practices, and awareness exercises described in the suppressed manuscripts offer specific methods for exploring the claims about human potential that these communities took for granted. Modern neuroscience research is beginning to provide scientific validation for experiences that the suppressed apostolic texts described in religious language. Studies of advanced meditation practitioners show measurable changes in brain structure and function that correspond to reports of expanded awareness, dissolution of ego boundaries, and access to information through non-ordinary means. The quantum physics revolution has created new appreciation for the relationship between consciousness and physical reality that parallels many of the insights contained in the suppressed texts. The discovery that observation affects quantum phenomena suggests that awareness may play a more fundamental role in shaping material existence than classical physics assumed. These converging lines of evidence suggest that the apostolic communities that were eliminated may have possessed understanding of consciousness and reality that was far ahead of their time. Their systematic suppression may have set back human development by centuries, eliminating knowledge about awareness transformation that we're only beginning to rediscover through contemporary research. The implications extend beyond individual spiritual development into questions about collective human evolution and the possibilities for social organization based on expanded consciousness rather than competitive individualism. The suppressed apostolic communities apparently demonstrated that human beings could function collectively at levels of intelligence and capability that transcended what any individual could achieve alone. The recovery of these suppressed teachings offers resources for addressing contemporary challenges that seem intractable from conventional perspectives. The ecological crisis, social inequality, psychological suffering, and spiritual emptiness that characterize modern civilization might be addressable through approaches to consciousness development that were systematically eliminated from Western culture over 15 centuries ago. But accessing this wisdom requires more than just intellectual study of ancient texts. The suppressed apostolic traditions consistently emphasize that their teachings could only be fully understood through direct experience rather than conceptual analysis. The practices they describe were designed to induce specific states of consciousness that would validate the insights through personal verification rather than requiring acceptance on faith or authority. This experiential approach to spiritual truth represents a fundamental challenge to both religious and secular institutions that depend on people accepting external authority rather than developing their own direct access to wisdom and understanding. The apostolic communities that were eliminated represented living proof that human beings could function effectively without requiring institutional mediation of their relationship to truth and divine intelligence. The question that haunts every serious investigation of these suppressed traditions is what human civilization might have become if these alternative approaches to consciousness development had been allowed to survive and evolve alongside institutional Christianity. The evidence suggests that we lost not just alternative theology, but practical wisdom for human development that could have transformed the entire trajectory of Western civilization. The gradual recovery of these suppressed apostolic voices through archaeological discovery represents an opportunity to reclaim aspects of human spiritual heritage that were thought to be lost forever. But it also reveals the extent to which institutional power has shaped human consciousness by systematically eliminating alternatives that might threaten established authority structures. The apostles they almost erased possessed knowledge about consciousness, reality, and human potential that was systematically suppressed because it empowered individuals and communities rather than institutions. Their teachings about direct spiritual experience, consciousness transformation, and the development of abilities that transcend ordinary limitation represent resources for human evolution that have been unavailable to Western civilization for over 15 centuries. The recovery of this suppressed wisdom is still in its early stages, with new manuscript discoveries continuing to expand our understanding of what was lost and what might still be recovered. Each archaeological breakthrough adds pieces to a puzzle that reveals the true diversity and sophistication of early Christian spirituality while raising new questions about what other suppressed traditions might be waiting to be rediscovered. But perhaps most importantly, these discoveries demonstrate that alternative possibilities for human development and social organization have existed throughout history, even when they were systematically suppressed by those who found them threatening to their authority. The apostolic communities that were eliminated proved that human beings are capable of far more than our current civilization typically imagines possible. The voices of the apostles they almost erased are beginning to speak again through the manuscripts that survived their systematic destruction. What they reveal about consciousness, reality, and human potential challenges not just our understanding of Christian origins, but our entire conception of what it means to be human in a universe that may be far more conscious and responsive than we have been taught to believe. The suppression of these apostolic traditions wasn't just historical accident, but systematic campaign to eliminate alternatives to institutional religious authority. The recovery of their teachings offers possibilities for consciousness development and spiritual growth that could transform how we understand human nature itself and our relationship to the divine intelligence that these ancient texts claimed was accessible to anyone willing to undertake the necessary inner work. The story of the apostles they almost erased reveals that the official version of Christian history represents only a fraction of the spiritual wisdom that was available in early Christian communities. The systematic elimination of alternative apostolic voices impoverished not just Christianity, but human consciousness itself, removing practical knowledge about awareness transformation that could have accelerated human development by centuries. As we continue to recover these suppressed teachings through archaeological discovery and scholarly research, we gain access to wisdom traditions that were thought to be lost forever. But more than historical curiosity, these discoveries offer practical resources for addressing contemporary challenges and developing human potential in ways that transcend the limitations imposed by cultures that have accepted institutional authority over direct spiritual experience. The apostles they almost erased may have been silenced by institutional power, but their teachings about consciousness, reality, and human transformation continue to resurface in forms adapted to contemporary understanding. Their wisdom offers pathways for development that could revolutionize not just individual spirituality, but the entire foundation upon which human civilization is built. The deeper we venture into these suppressed apostolic traditions, the more we uncover evidence of a systematic campaign that went beyond mere theological disagreement. This was nothing less than the complete rewriting of Christian history itself. The Church Fathers didn't just eliminate competing texts. They reconstructed the entire narrative of early Christianity to make it appear as though their version had always been the only authentic tradition. Consider the figure of Matthias again, whose selection as the replacement for Judas is mentioned only briefly in the canonical Acts. Recent analysis of Ethiopian manuscripts has revealed something extraordinary. The communities that preserved fragments of Matthias's teachings weren't isolated groups practicing fringe beliefs. They were sophisticated theological centers that maintained detailed records of apostolic succession and spiritual practices for over 8 centuries after the supposed apostolic age had ended. These manuscripts describe Matthias teaching what they called the science of spiritual sight, practices that could enable ordinary perception to expand beyond physical limitation and access what the texts termed the eternal dimensions of reality. According to these fragments, Matthias had received these techniques directly from Jesus during the 40 days between the resurrection and ascension, when the risen Christ appeared to the apostles and revealed teachings that weren't recorded in any canonical source. The Ethiopian texts provide step-by-step instructions for developing this expanded perception through specific breathing techniques, attention exercises, and methods for what they called consciousness projection. These weren't metaphorical descriptions of faith or devotion. They were precise technical instructions for systematically expanding human awareness beyond its ordinary boundaries. But what makes these discoveries truly explosive is how they reveal the sophistication of the suppression campaign itself. The elimination of Matthias's authentic teachings wasn't just about burning manuscripts. It involved creating false biographical accounts that reduced him to a minor figure whose only significance was filling an administrative vacancy among the 12. The canonical Acts presents Matthias as being chosen almost randomly through casting lots, suggesting that his selection was a matter of chance rather than spiritual qualification. But the Ethiopian manuscripts reveal that his appointment involved extensive evaluation of his consciousness development and his mastery of the advanced practices that Jesus had taught to his inner circle. According to these suppressed sources, Matthias had already achieved what the texts called apostolic consciousness before being formally recognized as one of the 12. His selection wasn't random chance, but acknowledgement of spiritual attainment that qualified him to carry forward the most advanced aspects of Jesus' teaching. The systematic distortion of Matthias's actual role represents a pattern that appears throughout the suppression campaign. Alternative apostolic figures weren't just eliminated, they were replaced with sanitized versions that removed any reference to the consciousness-expanding practices and spiritual abilities that were apparently central to their authentic ministries. The Gospel of Nicodemus, which we mentioned earlier, provides another stunning example of how this historical rewriting operated. The canonical Gospels present Nicodemus as a curious Pharisee who came to Jesus by night asking theological questions. But the suppressed Gospel of Nicodemus reveals him as an advanced practitioner of Jewish mysticism, who recognized Jesus as a master of the same consciousness technologies that had been preserved in esoteric Hebrew traditions for centuries. According to this forbidden text, the conversation between Jesus and Nicodemus wasn't about basic theological concepts like being born again. It was in technical discussion between spiritual adepts about methods for achieving what the text called divine embodiment, the permanent integration of expanded consciousness with physical existence. The Gospel of Nicodemus describes Jesus teaching advanced techniques for what it called conscious resurrection, practices that could enable awareness to transcend death while maintaining continuity of identity and memory. These weren't just beliefs about afterlife existence, but practical technologies for consciousness continuity that could be developed through systematic training. The suppression of this text eliminated understanding of the most advanced stages of spiritual development from Christian consciousness. Instead of recognizing that death could be transcended through proper preparation and practice, Christianity became focused on faith in Jesus' unique resurrection, rather than developing the abilities that he had apparently demonstrated and taught to others. The Acts of Paul and Thecla, another text that was systematically marginalized despite its wide circulation in early communities, reveals how women's apostolic authority was gradually eliminated through careful editing and reinterpretation. The canonical Acts mentions Thecla only briefly, but the complete Acts of Paul and Thecla presents her as Paul's equal in spiritual authority and teaching capability. According to the suppressed text, Thecla performed miracles, established churches, and received direct revelations that guided her ministry throughout Asia Minor and beyond. She wasn't just Paul's student or assistant, but an independent apostolic figure whose spiritual achievements equaled or exceeded those of the male apostles. The text describes Thecla teaching advanced practices for what it called virginal consciousness, states of awareness that transcended gender identification and sexual desire through complete integration with divine intelligence. These weren't teachings about celibacy or sexual repression, but sophisticated understanding of how sexual energy could be transformed into spiritual power. The systematic marginalization of Thekla's authentic authority eliminated feminine approaches to consciousness development that were apparently essential for complete spiritual realization. The fragments that survive suggest that her teachings provided methods for transcending gender limitation while honoring the unique qualities that masculine and feminine consciousness brought to spiritual practice. But perhaps the most shocking suppression involves what recent scholarship has uncovered about the Apostle John's actual teachings and the communities that preserved them. The canonical Gospel of John is already the most mystical of the four accepted Gospels, but the suppressed Johannine literature reveals spiritual insights and practices that make the canonical text seem elementary by comparison. The secret revelation of John, discovered among the Nag Hammadi manuscripts, presents cosmological teachings that describe reality as consisting of multiple dimensions of consciousness, interconnected through what the text calls emanational intelligence. According to this suppressed gospel, John received these revelations through direct visionary experience that revealed the hidden structure of existence itself. The text describes how individual consciousness becomes trapped in material limitation through identification with physical form and mental conditioning, and how it can be liberated through specific practices involving meditation, contemplation, and what the text calls pneumatic awakening. These weren't just theoretical descriptions, but practical instructions for systematically expanding awareness beyond ordinary limitation. The secret revelation of John contains detailed maps of consciousness that describe different levels of spiritual development and the specific challenges that practitioners encounter at each stage of awakening. These psychological insights were apparently central to Johannin's spiritual direction, providing frameworks for understanding and navigating the complex inner experiences that arise during consciousness transformation. But what makes the suppression of Johannine mysticism particularly tragic is how it eliminated understanding of the relationship between individual awakening and cosmic evolution. According to the suppressed texts, John taught that personal spiritual development wasn't just about individual salvation, but about participating in the ongoing evolution of universal consciousness itself. The secret revelation describes how awakened individuals become conscious participants in what the text calls the cosmic restoration, the gradual transformation of material reality through the expansion of divine consciousness within physical existence. This wasn't just metaphorical language about spiritual improvement, but practical description of how consciousness development affects the fundamental structure of reality. The elimination of these cosmic teachings left Christianity without understanding of how individual spiritual practice contributes to universal evolution. Instead of recognizing awakening as participation in cosmic transformation, the religion became focused primarily on personal salvation and individual relationship with God. The Gospel of the 12 Apostles, fragments of which have been discovered in various Middle Eastern archaeological sites, reveals that the traditional number 12 was itself a later construction that obscured the actual diversity of Jesus' apostolic community. According to these suppressed sources, Jesus worked with multiple circles of disciples that included far more than 12 individuals. The complete text apparently described an inner circle of 7 who received the deepest mystical teachings, a broader group of 24 who carried the practical instruction for community organization, and an even larger network of disciples who spread throughout the ancient world, establishing centers for consciousness development and spiritual practice. This more complex organizational structure explains many of the inconsistencies and gaps in the canonical accounts of apostolic activity. The canonical Acts focuses primarily on Paul's journeys, while mentioning only briefly the extensive missionary work that was apparently being conducted by dozens of other apostolic figures throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. The Gospel of the 12 Apostles apparently contained detailed accounts of apostolic missions to regions that were later forgotten in Christian historical consciousness, including extensive work in India, Central Asia, and Africa that established thriving communities, preserving advanced spiritual practices for centuries after the apostolic period supposedly ended. The suppression of this broader apostolic network eliminated understanding of Christianity as a truly global movement from its earliest stages. Instead of recognizing the religion as emerging simultaneously across multiple cultures and continents, church history was rewritten to make it appear as though Christianity spread primarily through Greek and Roman cultural channels. The Acts of Andrew and Bartholomew, preserved only in fragments that hint at the sophistication of the complete text, apparently documented the most advanced understanding of healing and psychosomatic medicine that existed in apostolic communities. These texts described illness not as random biological malfunction, but as manifestation of consciousness disturbances that could be corrected through specific therapeutic approaches. According to the surviving fragments, Andrew and Bartholomew developed systematic methods for diagnosing the psychological and spiritual roots of physical disease and addressing them through what we might now call consciousness-based medicine. Their healing work involved detailed analysis of thought patterns, emotional states, and energy blockages that created corresponding disturbances in biological function. The complete acts apparently included precise protocols for different categories of illness and specific techniques for correcting the consciousness imbalances that generated them. These weren't just general principles about the relationship between mind and body, but practical medical procedures that could be learned and applied systematically by trained practitioners. The elimination of these apostolic healing traditions left Christianity without understanding of the intimate relationship between consciousness and health. Instead of developing medical approaches that addressed the psychological roots of physical disease, the religion became increasingly separated from practical healing work that was relegated to secular medical professionals. The secret gospel of Peter, known only through hostile references that were themselves later suppressed, apparently contained the most profound understanding of what early Christians called the resurrection body, a subtle energy structure that could be developed through spiritual practice and eventually function independently of physical form. According to these obscure references, Peter taught that the resurrection wasn't just about Jesus' unique post-death appearances, but about the development of consciousness abilities that every human being could potentially achieve through proper training and preparation. The resurrection body wasn't something that appeared after death, but could be cultivated during physical life through specific practices. The secret gospel apparently provided detailed instructions for developing this subtle energy structure through techniques involving breath control, energy circulation, and consciousness projection. These practices were designed to gradually strengthen the non-physical aspects of human existence until they could function with complete independence from biological support systems. The complete suppression of these resurrection body teachings left Christianity without practical understanding of what resurrection actually involved. Instead of recognizing it as a consciousness development that could be systematically achieved, the religion became focused on believing in Jesus' unique resurrection, rather than developing the abilities that he had apparently demonstrated and taught to others. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene, beyond the fragments that have already been discovered, apparently contained the most complete documentation of feminine wisdom traditions and their essential role in consciousness development. Recent analysis of manuscript traditions suggests that Mary's complete gospel was systematically divided into smaller portions that were attributed to different sources in order to obscure its original scope and authority. The voices they tried to silence are speaking again. Through cracked papyrus and weathered stone, through manuscripts hidden in desert caves and forgotten monastery walls, the apostles they almost erased are finally telling their story. And what they reveal challenges everything we thought we knew about the origins of Christianity itself. These weren't just theological disagreements or minor disputes about doctrine. This was systematic historical revision on a scale that defies comprehension. An entire dimension of early Christianity was eliminated so completely that for over 1,500 years, most believers had no idea it had ever existed. The mystical traditions, the consciousness-expanding practices, the egalitarian communities, the feminine wisdom teachings, all of it buried beneath the weight of institutional power and political convenience. But perhaps that's exactly why these texts survived. Truth has a way of resisting even the most determined efforts to destroy it. The divine spark that these suppressed apostles taught existed within every human being proved stronger than the forces that sought to extinguish it. Their teachings about direct spiritual experience, consciousness transformation, and human potential continue to emerge from the sands of time, waiting for a generation ready to receive what earlier ages found too threatening to preserve. The implications extend far beyond ancient history into the very heart of contemporary spiritual seeking. If the apostolic traditions that were eliminated contained practical wisdom for consciousness development that remains relevant today, then we're not just recovering historical documents. We're reclaiming aspects of human spiritual heritage that could transform how we understand ourselves and our relationship to the divine intelligence that underlies all existence. The apostles they almost erased may have been silenced by institutional power, but their voices echo through every archaeological discovery, every translated manuscript, every seeker who recognizes that the official story was never the complete story. The question isn't whether these suppressed teachings were authentic. The question is whether we're ready to hear what they have to say about the unlimited potential that lies dormant within human consciousness itself. The mystery continues to unfold, one buried gospel at a time. And somewhere in the desert, sands and forgotten libraries of the world, more voices are waiting to speak truths that could change everything we thought we knew about the message that transformed the ancient world and might yet transform our own.